trusts or wills or powers of attorney. I'll be mentioning those things a little bit, but this is more about the practical things you need to get done when somebody passes away. Okay, so for those of you who are here in person, you should have a handout. If you walked in and didn't grab one, feel free to grab one at the front. For those of you at home, Ashley or somebody at the library will be emailing you a PDF of the handout. And it's basically going to have a little bit of the information you'll see on the slides, and then also some blank spaces for you to take your own notes. For any little reminders or specific circumstances that apply to you, feel free to jot it down. For those of you at home, since you don't have the little handout right now, feel free to grab a notepad to start writing things down, or open up, a Word document, something on your computer if you're more comfortable typing. There will be a lot of information thrown at you, and it's usually best to write that down when all of that information is fresh in your head. Okay, the first thing you should do is ask for help. So that might seem a little bit strange, but you should always ask for help. When someone you love passes away, you are most likely going to be very, very overwhelmed with grief and other emotions. So keeping track of all of the tasks you need to accomplish can be even more difficult. Even if you're an extremely organized person and you know exactly what you need to do, grief really affects everybody in very different ways. And it can't hurt to have as many hands and as many minds as possible to help you throughout the whole process. So if you have family and friends, please don't hesitate to ask them. If you don't have family or friends that you can really rely on, or you don't feel comfortable asking them, you can consult a website, griefshare.org. It's just a general website. It's from a non-denominational church, and they just provide some information. And if you don't have a local house of worship that you attend, or your own faith-based community to also help you out, especially with your grief, you can consult that website, and they have information on local groups in your area if you want to join them. Okay, so number one on the handout is gathering important documents, and this is going to take a little bit of time. There are a lot of different documents that you might need to gather depending on your loved one's particular situation. First, the first place to look should be your loved one's home. So if you are the surviving spouse or an adult child, or you have a key to their home, that should be easy for you to access. Try to find the location where they keep their important documents, usually the bottom or the top of a filing cabinet or a drawer in the kitchen or in the bedroom. Sometimes bedroom closet is usually where people keep their important documents. That's the first place you should look. Second place is their safe deposit box. So if you are an owner on the safe deposit box, then that'll be easy for you. You can go to the bank, get inside that box and find all the documents and make the copies, whatever you need to do. If you are not an owner of the safe deposit box, then it becomes a little bit tricky. You'll need to get legal authority to access the box, whether that's through probate court or whether that's through a trust that your loved one left behind. You'll need to do it through that process. Because all of you are here right now and clearly you're planning for yourselves and hopefully for your loved ones, what I highly, highly recommend is when you go home, talk to your family and friends and tell them that if they do keep all of their important legal documents in a safe deposit box, that they should not keep it there. And that might seem counterintuitive because it's a safe deposit box. The word safe is in the title. You would think that's the best place to keep them, but really you should keep them at home, because if your loved one passes away and you're not an owner of the box, then you have to go through the legal hoops, whether that's a trust or probate court or a small estate affidavit. There's a variety of different ways. You have to go through those hoops first before you can get into the box. So if you just keep all those important documents at home, it is much, much easier for you to access. And also you can access it on weekends and holidays outside of business hours of the bank. We have no idea when a loved one is going to pass away, when they're going to have a medical emergency, or when you will need to access those documents. It could be at 3 a.m. It could be a Friday night. We don't know. So generally keep those documents at home if you can. somewhere safe, easy to access. And then for the people in your lives who are important, who will likely be going through this checklist of their own, tell them where you've kept those documents. So this way, that process is a little bit easier for everyone going forward. Wills and trusts. If your loved one had a will or a trust or multiple trusts, those are important documents you'll need to find. If you can't find them in the house or in the safe deposit box, you can try contacting the attorney who created those documents. They might have a copy. Also, the state of Illinois has a depository for wills. So if your loved one deposited it with the state of Illinois, then the state would have a copy of that as well. Or actually, they would have the original. You might also need birth certificates or marriage certificates for your loved one. So these are types of vital records, and Lake County has a copy or certified copies of those vital records, and they can provide those to you if you submit an application and pay whatever their current fee is. You need to be a family member or an authorized person in order to get those records. So you can go to Lake County's website if you want, lakecountyil.gov, to find the relevant information there. You can also find their phone number there and give them a call if you want to talk to somebody on the phone to give you an explanation about what kind of paperwork you need to submit in order to get those records. The death certificate for your loved one is something that you will definitely need to get, and you will likely need multiple certified copies of the death certificate. You'll have to provide a certified copy to all of the financial institutions where your loved one had an account, and possibly also government institutions, especially if they were receiving government benefits. If you're planning a funeral for your loved one, the funeral director will be able to get certified copies of the death certificate for you. They will include that in their fees. But if you're not planning a funeral, maybe finances are tight or your loved one really didn't leave much behind to pay for a funeral, then you can get the death certificate directly by yourself by going to Lake County. You'll also need life insurance policies if your loved one had any life insurance. So if they had one through their employer, you'll need to contact their employer to get the term life policy that many employers provide for their employees. And if they had life insurance through any other financial institution, you'll need to contact them to get a copy of that policy if you can't find it in your loved one's home or in their safe deposit box. If your loved one had funeral arrangements or funeral instructions, you'll also need to find that. Sometimes these instructions will be included in the power of attorney that a loved one may create, whether they did that on their own or they did it with an attorney, they might have it there, or they might have left just written instructions on a piece of paper. If you know that your loved one maybe had a prepaid burial plot or a prepaid funeral plan, an arrangement they had made in advance, hopefully you can find a copy of that agreement or that contract when you're going through your loved one's paperwork. Or you can contact the house of worship where your loved one attended and talk to the religious leader there to see if they have the contract or paperwork for arrangements like that. You might also need their social security card. Most of the time, you just need the social security number of your loved one. You really don't need the card. If you don't know what the number is, you can always request a replacement social security card by contacting the Social Security Administration. You can go to ssa.gov to find the forms you need to submit. Of course, like with any other account or information, personal information for your loved one, you need to prove that you are authorized to obtain this information. Fill out the application, submit the application, and the Social Security Administration will mail out a new Social Security card to the address that you indicate. You can also call the Social Security Administration, especially if you need to discuss survivor's benefits. So for example, if your spouse passed away and you might be entitled to Social Security benefits as the husband or the wife of the person who passed away, you might want to talk to somebody at the Social Security Administration. You can call them. You can find their phone number online. What I have found is anytime you call a government institution, you want to call as early as possible. So as soon as their phone line is open, you should get on the phone. because if you wait until later in the day, you will likely have very long wait times. And the Social Security Administration, as well as the IRS and other institutions, will hang up on you if you've been on hold for too long. So they call it a courtesy disconnect. I don't think it's courteous at all. I find it very frustrating and it's a kind of a waste of time, but they'll hang up on you if you've been on hold for a really long time. So if you really want to talk to somebody if you really want to talk to a person instead of getting on the computer, then just call as early as possible to get somebody on the line. You'll also need your loved one's tax returns. So if you are married to your loved one, hopefully you know where your tax return copies are. If you weren't married to them and you can't find them anywhere in the house, if you know if your loved one had an accountant, you can contact the accountant to get a copy of the tax returns. If you don't know if your loved one had an accountant or you know they didn't have one and you just can't find a copy of the tax returns, you can contact the IRS as well as the Department of Revenue for the state of Illinois to get a copy. You can call the IRS if you would like, just like you can call the Social Security Administration if you want to get somebody on the phone to give you an explanation. Or you can go to irs.gov if you just want to look up information online and to find the kind of forms you need to fill out and submit. You will need, if you're contacting the IRS for copies of the previous tax returns, you will need to submit a form and pay a fee per tax return, so for each year. And you will need to get the last 7 years worth of tax returns. So just like when we file our income taxes now, we should keep the last 7 years so we know what happened in the previous 7 years. That's partly because if the IRS is going to come after you for any sort of judgment or anything like that, unpaid taxes, they look at the most recent 7 years. Whoa, I think I lost my earpiece. Oh, the Department of Revenue for state of Illinois, because we have to pay taxes to, of course, the federal government as well as the state government, since Illinois charges or levies income tax. So you will need the past 7 years worth of tax returns. You can call the IRS. Again, call them really early in the morning because they have extremely long wait times. If you want somebody to explain to you over the phone what kind of forms you need to fill out and how to submit them. And you will also need to file the final income tax return for your loved one. So if you were married, filing jointly, that will be easier because you will still be alive. So you'll be filing your income tax return going forward, except not married anymore. But if you were not married to your loved one, then you're still responsible for filing their final income tax return. So just like we file our income tax return in the next year. So for 2024, we filed that in 2025. You still have to do the same thing for your loved one, even though they have passed away. So let's say I have a family member who passes away tomorrow. I would need to file their 2024 income tax return next year. So you want to make sure you get the past 7 years worth of returns. That's important because if you're legally in charge of administering your loved one's estate, so their estate is basically all of their finances, their assets and their liabilities, those kinds of things. If you're the person in charge of that, you're legally responsible for also paying the final income tax return from your loved one's assets. And then also any back taxes that might have been due that your loved one just forgot to pay or maybe didn't pay. So that's why you want to go through the past 7 years to make sure that all of that's paid. And if your loved one is owed a refund, you also want to make sure you make note of that so you can keep an eye out for that check in the future. If your loved one was divorced or had a separation agreement, you'll also want to find that. If you can't find it in the house, hopefully you have the attorney's contact information if your loved one had an attorney handle that for them, and the attorney should have a copy of that. And as a last resort, you can try contacting the ex-spouse of your loved one to get any divorce agreements or separation agreements. And that's particularly important if your loved one had any minor children. So any children under the age of 18, maybe the loved one was paying child support, or maybe the loved one was receiving child support for their children. So that's another important document that you'll need to find if it's applicable. You'll also need financial statements. So anywhere your loved one had a financial account, like a bank account, certificate of deposit, if they had investments, annuities, if they had a pension, a retirement account, 401k, anything like that, you're definitely going to need to get that information. You'll contact the financial institution that manages that account. So if they had a bank account or multiple accounts at Chase, you'll need to contact Chase Bank. If they had a 401k through their employer, you'll need to contact the employer. Or if they had a pension through the government, you'll need to contact those institutions as well. And they will be able to give you those documents if you haven't been able to find them in your loved one's home or in the safe deposit box. If your loved one had a loan or a mortgage, you'll also need to make sure you find a copy of that agreement. If they leased their home or apartment, you'll want to find a copy of the lease. You can get that from their landlord. And if they owned real estate and they had tenants, so if they were leasing out any of their real estate to people, you'll also want to make sure you find a copy of those leases as well. If they own their home or any real estate, you'll need to get the deeds to those homes as well. You can get a copy of the deeds for all pieces of real estate from the county where that real estate is located. So we're in Lake County. I assume many of you live in Lake County or nearby. You would have to contact Lake County, their recorder department, to get a copy of those deeds. You can always give them a call if you want to get more information for how to do that. You can go in person. Lake County, the recorder department's in Waukegan. That's not too far from here. So if you want somebody in person to explain everything to you, you can go there. You could also go online to the same website that I mentioned earlier, lakecountyil.gov, and you can purchase a copy of the deed online. If you've never searched for a deed, it can be a little tricky figuring that out. You have to pay $5 per day to search on Lake County, and then $1 per page if you want to download it. And it might be a little bit tricky to figure out which document you're looking for because there are many different kinds of deeds. There's also liens, releases, and mortgages. Those are the different kinds of titles for documents that are filed that might come up in your search. So if you're comfortable doing it on your own, that's great. You can just get online and pay for those copies. Or you can go to Lake County and have one of the clerks there do the search for you, and then they can print it out, and then you just pay the fee if that's easier for you. If your loved one had any vehicles, you'll also need to make sure you have a copy of those vehicle titles. So if you haven't found a copy in the home of your loved one or in the safe deposit box, you can get a duplicate title from the Secretary of State. So if you just go to their website, which is ilsos.gov, you can find the forms that you would need to fill out and submit. I think right now you need to print it out, you need to submit it by mail, and then pay whatever the fee is. I believe it's $50 the last time I checked. You pay that fee, and then you can get a duplicate title. And that will be important when you are moving forward and maybe selling the vehicle or administering your loved one's estate. And if you have any questions, you can again call the Secretary of State if you want. They have a phone number for Springfield and they have a phone number for Chicago. I find Springfield is a better place to call because the population there in general around Springfield is a lot lower than Chicago. So the Chicago line, I think, gets clogged up a bit. So you can always try calling the Springfield location and somebody on the phone can tell you what forms you need to fill out, what the fees are, and how to submit those forms. You'll also need to find all of the relevant insurance policies that your loved one had. So whether that's for their vehicles, their home, health insurance, I mentioned life insurance earlier, long-term care insurance, that's another type of insurance. There's accident insurance, all kinds of insurance policies. You'll need to find a copy of those. And hopefully you will have found that in your loved one's home. You'll also need to find all of their bills. So their electricity bill, the water and sewer bill from the municipality, any other bills that they regularly receive, make sure you find those since you'll be in charge of paying off those bills as well. Your loved one may have also had a storage locker or somewhere where they stored additional stuff like many of us do have. And that might be another thing to keep an eye out for. As much as we know our loved ones, we don't know every little thing about their lives. So all of the different kinds of paperwork that I'm going over as just an example of the different kinds of paperwork you might need to find for your loved one. If your loved one owned a business, you'll definitely want to contact their business partners if they had any, their office manager if they had an office manager, or their employees, or the accountant for your loved one to gather that paperwork. Usually people keep their business records at their office and not at home unless they work from home. So you might need to go to your loved one's business off, wherever that is, whatever kind of business they have, and go through their filing cabinets, drawers, what have you, in order to find that information. If your loved one was in the military, you will definitely want to contact the military to get a copy of their service records, especially if you're entitled to survivor's benefits. So if you're a spouse, or if your loved one had dependent children, then you or the children might be entitled to some benefits from the government. And that can be life insurance, it can be health insurance, and it can even be a monetary amount towards their funeral. So you'll want to get that. You can go to the va.gov to find more information for how to get that. There is an application you'd have to fill out and send. If your loved one had a login for MillConnect, which is just the system for them to log into for their military service records, you can use that to get in and get a copy. Now is a good time to mention that if your loved one had any kind of online accounts, whether that's a login for their bank or their credit card, or even just social media like Facebook or Instagram or anything like that, you should hopefully find a copy of all of their usernames and their passwords. And that's really, really, really important, because as you go through this whole process, it is much easier to access any account when you have the username and the password, or the passkey or the PIN, whatever it is that you need to log in. If you have that, it's so much easier. Otherwise, you have to jump through more hoops. So since all of you are here right now proactively planning, I recommend that when you go home, when you find some time for yourself over the weekend, create a list of all of your usernames and passwords and keep that updated every year. And that sounds cumbersome, because it can be, but it will make the process much, much easier for your loved ones after you pass away. Or even if you're in an accident and you're in the hospital and you can't get into your accounts to pay bills, then they would be able to do that for you. And I recommend keeping that list in the same pile of legal paperwork if you have that, and keeping that somewhere at home that's easy for you to access. And then tell your loved ones or whoever you have named to be in charge of your estate and your own checklist after you pass away. Tell them where it is so they can easily access that. And that will make this whole process a lot smoother. It's easy to forget that when you are going through this in the future, you will likely be very emotionally overwhelmed, as I mentioned before. So you might know right now off the top of your head where everything is and what to do, but when the time comes, it can be a lot harder to execute. You will also need to find your loved one's passport, their driver's license, if they had a driver's license, their state ID, and the keys to their home. Hopefully you can find that all in their home or in the safe deposit box. All right. Moving on, number 3 on the handout, you also need to prepare for the funeral. If your loved one left behind instructions, you can refer to those instructions. If they didn't leave behind any instructions and you really have the discretion to carry out the funeral, there are a lot of things that you do need to consider. So you can start off by contacting the local funeral homes, whichever location is easiest for you or the family and friends who will attend the service. Try to go in person and get an itemized list of the costs for all of the goods and services, so you can compare notes when you get back home when you're planning for the funeral. So the costs of different caskets, urns, different kinds of options for the funeral. If money is not an issue, that's great. You can do whatever you think is appropriate to honor your loved one. But if money is an issue, then it is really important to compare the costs and the different kinds of services. So you don't have to buy the Rolls Royce of caskets for your loved one for their funeral. Sometimes you can feel pressured to do that when you're at the funeral home discussing options. You might feel like that's what's best for your loved one. But if finances are an issue, you don't have to max out your own credit cards or go into debt yourself to pay for your loved one's funeral. There are ways to minimize those costs. So that's why you should compare the different kinds of options from the funeral directors. You can also purchase your own casket or urn separately from the funeral home. You don't have to buy it from them, and then you can provide that to the funeral home for the service. I recommend you bring a friend with you who isn't as emotionally invested as you are, so they can help keep you grounded and give you more perspective when you are going through the different funeral options. You'll also want to consider if you want to have a slideshow, for example, of your photos of your loved one or videos or anything like that and the costs associated with that. Or if you want to keep it more modest, if you don't expect too many people to attend, you don't have to pay for flowers everywhere, just flowers in a smaller room, things like that. So it's good to bring a family member or a friend who can help you manage that as well. As I mentioned before, the funeral director can also get you the certified copies of the death certificate for your loved one. So if you are going through them, they can help you with that. You, of course, can also get it on your own, as I mentioned before. And then lastly, for the funeral, make sure that you have somebody in your home or your loved one's home during the funeral. Most of the time when you plan a funeral, you'll publish the obituary in the newspaper or send out a notice on social media, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you want to send it. And anybody can really see that. And it is possible that there may be thieves out there or burglars who will know no one's home at that particular address. And you would be surprised how easy it is to find out what your address is just by going online. So you may want to consider asking a friend or a neighbor to house sit for you during the funeral, just to make sure that your valuables, as well as your loved one's valuables, remain safe. Number 4, you'll need to contact a lot of different financial institutions. As I mentioned before, when you are going through your loved one's home or their storage locker or their safe deposit box, hopefully you'll find all the records, and then you'll need to contact those banks and those insurance companies, investment companies, and let them know that your loved one has passed away. They will likely require a certified copy of the death certificate. Some of them will want the actual certified copy, the physical piece of paper that you purchased from the county. Others might be okay with just a scanned copy that's emailed to them. You won't really know until you contact the financial institution. So you'll need to give them those copies while you are processing your loved one's estate, especially if you're going to be changing the ownership and updating it when you have joint accounts with your loved one. So if you had a joint bank account, and now that your spouse or your loved one has passed away, you want to make sure that the bank knows you're the only owner now. You'll want to make sure you contact the bank and give them the death certificate in order to accomplish that. During the estate administration process, you'll also need to transfer your loved one's assets to the beneficiaries that they named. So if they had a life insurance policy and they named you as a beneficiary, you would get the life insurance money. If they had a transfer on death bank account or another kind of bank account where they had a beneficiary named, you would be responsible for giving the money that's left over after you pay all the debts and expenses to the beneficiaries. So you'll want to make sure that you do that as well. And as I mentioned before when I started, whether you do that through probate court or through a trust is a completely different topic. So you would, in order to go through those details, that would likely be a different seminar at a later time. But that in general, that is something that you would also need to do. Transfer your loved one's assets to their beneficiaries or their heirs. And if you need any advice on how to update the insurance policies or how to update the accounts, especially investment accounts, you can always contact professionals. I'm sure the library has free resources that you can consult, self-help books, but you can always ask an accountant if you need to, or a life insurance agent or an investment advisor to give you the best advice for how to update those insurance needs or those investment needs going forward. You'll also need to contact government institutions, like I mentioned, Social Security Administration, maybe Medicare, the VA, maybe Medicaid. So you can give them a call or go online, if va.gov for the VA or ssa.gov for Social Security Administration, to tell them that your loved one has passed away, provide the death certificate, and then update the benefits if you are entitled to any survivor's benefits from the VA or the Social Security Administration. If your loved one had Medicare, then you'll also need to make sure that's updated as well to see if you still qualify for health insurance through Medicare as the surviving spouse, or if your loved one had any young children who will need continued health coverage. And just to clarify, some people get a little bit confused about the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare is a federal program that provides health insurance to people who are 65 years old and older, and also to people who are under 65 if they have a disability, regardless of their income. And then Medicaid is a need-based program provided by the federal government and the state of Illinois to people who have very, very little income and very, very few or no assets at all. And they can get insurance through Medicaid as well as supplemental income through Medicaid. If you were very dependent on your loved one's income, maybe they were your spouse and they were the sole earner and they have passed away, you may now be entitled to government assistance such as Medicaid. So that's something to keep in mind. And another reason you might need to contact that government institution. You'll also need to contact all of your loved one's creditors, as well as the major credit bureaus. So as you go through the estate administration process, I mentioned you would need to pay their final income tax return. You also need to pay their bills or credit card bills, things like that. So you'll need to contact all of those creditors. One thing that's important to note is that you can always negotiate with the creditors of your loved ones, whether that's ComEd or whether that's the IRS, you can always negotiate. So if your loved one didn't really leave that many assets behind and there isn't much left to pay off those debts, you can try to have those debts reduced. And you can do that with any creditor. That doesn't mean the creditor will say yes, but you can always try. It does not hurt to ask. If you and your loved one had joint credit cards, you might want to keep those credit card accounts open, especially if you have really good credit history, because that might be useful for you as you move forward and maybe you apply for a loan or a mortgage or buy a new vehicle. So that might be a good reason to keep that open. Otherwise, you would also be responsible for closing those accounts. On the handout, you'll see there's some detailed information that you might need to provide to the major credit bureaus, just letting them know that your loved one has passed away. You can mail them a letter or give them a call if you don't feel comfortable mailing that information. So this way they are on notice that your loved one has passed away, and hopefully that can prevent fraudsters from using your loved one's Social Security number to apply for loans or credit applications under your loved one's name. So you'll want to make sure that you notify the credit bureaus of that. Number 7 on the handout, you'll want to plan for bills in your budget. And this applies if you and your loved one shared any expenses or if you live together, particularly for those who are married or in a civil union. You'll want to plan for your future. So you might need to reevaluate your own budget. Maybe you have less income coming in now because your spouse has passed away and of course they're not working. So now you have less income. So you might need to revise that. If you need help with that, you can always hire a professional or talk to a professional or consult self-help resources at the library. If your loved one passed away and they were your spouse, you will likely need to reassess your retirement as well, because maybe your plan was to retire much sooner because you were dependent on your spouse's income and were expecting that to continue. But now that they've passed away, you might need to reassess your retirement and your retirement withdrawals. So that's also important. That's not a first order of business when we're going through this checklist. Of course, you would have to go through the funeral and pay off all your loved one's expenses and whatnot, but that's something to keep in mind for yourself so you can plan appropriately going forward. You'll also need to cancel any unnecessary memberships or clubs. So if your loved one really liked bird watching, maybe they got a bird watchers magazine every month or every quarter. So that's something that you would need to cancel. They might have an Amazon Prime subscription or some sort of auto delivery for certain goods or services. So you'll want to make note of that when you're going through your loved one's paperwork and make sure you cancel all of that as well. If you live together and you want to continue those subscriptions, of course, that's perfectly fine. But that's something that can easily be missed, especially when you're in the thick of things and grieving. You might not realize that there's a monthly subscription that the credit card is still being charged for. So that's something to make note of. I know I've mentioned this a bunch of times already, but you'll also want to contact your loved one's accountant. So in order to get the previous tax returns, to file the final income tax return, and to take care of any of the unpaid taxes or any taxes that will be due. So make sure you do that. If your loved one had an accountant, if they didn't have an accountant, you of course are free to do it on your own. I'm not a CPA, so I don't really know that much about filing income tax returns, so I would hire an accountant. But if finances are tight, you don't necessarily have to. Just keep in mind that as a person who's in charge of administering their estate, you are still legally responsible for taking care of that and taking care of that competently. So I always recommend hiring a professional to do that for you if you're not able to do that yourself. If you're waiting on a refund for your loved one, you might want to keep a bank account open in their name. And that depends on whether you're going through a trust or the probate court. So that could be a little bit different. But keep in mind that you don't want to completely close out all the bank accounts when you're going through the estate administration, because you are still going to be waiting on that final income tax return and you might owe more money. Excuse me, your loved one might owe more money or they might be due a refund. So you'll want to keep at least one account open for that purpose. If your loved one and you were married and you were filing jointly or married filing separately, and since they passed away, you're going to have to file your taxes differently. So that's why it's also a good idea to contact an accountant, because you might be eligible for different tax elections now that you are not married versus when you were, and that can really change the deductions that you're taking. So that's another reason why it's a good idea to contact an accountant. And you'll also need to update your own beneficiaries. So if your loved one was a beneficiary on your retirement plan or on your bank account, or you owned your home together, those are the major things that you will need to update. So if they were your primary beneficiary for your life insurance and they passed away before you, you will need to contact your life insurance company and let them know that you want to change the beneficiary. Same is true for any bank accounts if you own them jointly with your loved one or if they were a beneficiary there. Same is true for any vehicles that you may have owned with your loved one. For real estate, you don't necessarily need to update that, but some people like to do that so it's clear who's the owner. And if there is still a mortgage on the property, the bank might require that so there's a clear record that you are now the sole owner of the property. So those are other things to consider. And again, this is after you take care of a lot of the upfront heavy lifting. If you have the mental bandwidth and emotional bandwidth to do it all at the same time, that's great. But at this point in the presentation, we're going over the checklist of items for yourself that usually are done after the preliminary administration. And if your loved one had a business, you're also going to need to manage that. That's can be very complicated depending on what it is. If they left behind instructions for continuing the business, you can follow those. Or you can hire professionals to help you close down the business, cancel all the vendor contracts, things like that. And then lastly, you'll need to prepare and protect your own future. So I know I've mentioned this a bunch of times already, but you'll want to update your own financial picture and your own plan going forward. So if you have any powers of attorney, if you have wills or trusts or prepaid funeral arrangements, or you're thinking about that, that would be a good time to update all of that information. Okay, so that concludes all the information I have to present to you. We, I think, are going until 8 o'clock, and that's because I wanted to make sure there's a lot of time for questions. Usually there are lots of questions for these kinds of seminars. So I'd be happy to answer them. Ashley, if anybody has posted anything in the chat that you want to read out loud, that would be great.
Yeah, I've got a couple here. So the first one is, you were talking about birth certificates, death certificates, and marriage certificates, and the person's asking if Lake County is going to have those even if the event happened outside of Lake County. So what if the person didn't pass away in Lake County? Would it be in the county that they
passed away in?
Yeah.
So whenever somebody passes away, there would be a coroner's report which shows where they passed away. So if let's say they were on vacation and in Florida and there was a hurricane and they passed away there, then you would contact the county where they passed away in order to get a copy of the death certificate.
So the death certificate is written in the county in which they passed away. Okay. And the same would be for marriage as well.
Marriage certificates are, the original certificate is created in the county where the marriage actually took place and where it was registered, but you can register your marriage in a different state when you move, which many people do. It's not necessary. So it would be, if your loved one moved from the original place where they got married, then it would be in the county where they lived. Otherwise, the marriage certificate might still be with just the original county where the marriage took place.
Super easy, right? It's all very easy. Okay, so here's another question. If you already contacted Social Security, do you need to contact Medicare separately?
That's a very good question. I think if you're contacting Social Security for survivors benefits, then you're going to be talking to a different sub-department than if you're contacting Social Security for Medicare for health insurance. So you will likely have to talk to two different people because it's not the same department.
Yep.
And if anybody has questions, anyone who's here in person, feel free to raise your hand and I'm happy to call you out as I see your hands. Go ahead.
For example, royalties on published works or from patents. And does that go to a beneficiary, or is that something that has to be determined before the person dies?
So that
publisher royalties.
So the question was about if the loved one who passed away, if they have patents or royalties that they're entitled to, who receives those? Do those continue? How does that work? That depends on what the agreement is. So I don't really know. I wouldn't be able to say. I don't know what the royalties are. For a lot of people, famous people who do have royalties, those sometimes do continue with surviving family members based on the term in the contract for those royalties, but I wouldn't be able to give you a clear answer because I have no idea what's in that contract. Yes, it is possible. Yes. Go ahead.
Like that is very overwhelming. Is this something you have to do it all yourself? I mean, or where if they don't.
So the question was that the checklist is very overwhelming, which it is. Even for me, this is something that I have a lot of experience in. It's still really overwhelming. You can always hire a professional. So I mentioned a lot of professionals while I was talking, like accountants, investment advisors. Didn't really mention attorneys that much just because I'm an attorney. Don't want you to think that I'm telling you to hire me. But yes, you can hire an attorney to help you with the entire process. So whether you're going through probate court, whether you have a trust, a loved one's trust to administer, whether you have neither of those, you will likely need help figuring out what to do, the exact legal process, so you can hire an attorney to help you do that. A lot of times, the attorney will charge by the hour for a lot of this. So it's best if they just handle the legal part and you're the one on the phone with the credit card companies negotiating that debt down. Otherwise, the attorney is just going to be charging you by the hour for those kinds of things. Most of that doesn't really require legal expertise, maybe some negotiating skills, but things like getting the death certificates or calling the life insurance company, things like that, you can do on your own at a lower cost, of course. But yes, you're always free to hire an attorney to help you. Yes.
From online, there's a question is, do all spouses qualify for spousal benefit from Social Security?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I am not an expert in Social Security benefits or spousal benefits. Some spouses do, but not all spouses do. And I think it might also be dependent on the income. But that was a reason why I said you would need to contact the Social Security Administration to see if you are entitled to any benefits. Yes, go ahead.
Your spouse receives a government pension. Who is it that you actually contact then? My husband was a police officer and he has a pension through the village that he worked. But it's part of an overall downstate Illinois pension plan. So who would be contacted? The village of Wilmette or?
So I don't know who's in charge of all of the different pension plans. So sorry, the question was, who do you contact if your loved one had a pension? The first thing you should do is go through the former employer. So if that was a police department, fire department, ask them who is in charge of managing the pensions and distributing all of that, and they can give you the contact information, so you can get that information.
Yeah, just to sort of, I've gone through that part, and there is a sort of a designated person on the staff. It's usually in the HR of, the municipality or the police department that can be your Sherpa through the whole thing.
Well, that's helpful to know. Thank you. The Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund.
IMRF.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the answers to all different kinds of questions. I'm not an expert in all of the areas. But like I said, if you have your loved one had a pension, if they had a life insurance policy, if they had any kind of financial accounts, you would need to contact the department or the people who are in charge of managing that. And so someone here who attended in person said that there is the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, was it? Yes. So that could be the person or department you might need to contact for your loved one.
There's another question here. It says, do you still have to go through probate if your loved one's assets are all TOD? I don't know what that is.
TOD means transfer on death. Another acronym is payable on death, POD. If everything is TOD, if every financial account they have has a beneficiary named, then you most likely would not need to go through probate court. But I can't give anybody an exact answer because I don't know the financial details of the person, so I wouldn't be able to say. But generally, if everything has a beneficiary named, if every asset has a beneficiary name, then you likely don't need to go through the probate court process. It's usually the real estate that tricks people up and requires family to have to go through probate court because you might have a beneficiary named for life insurance, retirement accounts, bank accounts. You can have bank accounts that have TOD. But for real estate, a lot of people don't name a beneficiary for their real estate. And regardless of the value of the real estate, if your loved one owned real estate and there's no beneficiary named on the real estate, then when all of the owners of the real estate pass away, it would go through the probate court process. There is a beneficiary document in Illinois that you can file for real estate. It's called a transfer on death instrument. So you'd have to fill that out and sign it and have it notarized and record that in the county where the real estate is located. Some counties have a standard form. Otherwise, you can go through an attorney who can prepare it for you. You will, if you Google it, you can find some forms out there that are standard. If you want to print it out and fill it out yourself, you're just running the risk of not filling it out correctly. So generally, I would recommend just having an attorney do it for you. Everybody charges a different fee, but if you want to try doing it on your own, you can find a form online. And then you also have to pay the recording fee. So for deeds or transfer on death instruments that are recorded for real estate, you'll have to pay the county's recording fee. So Lake County, I believe, is $70 for deeds. It might be different for TODIs. Every county has a different fee. Yeah, TODI, that stands for Transfer on Death Instrument. Yes, there's a question in the back.
Hopefully to learn, and say I have $3,000 balance. Would my beneficiaries necessarily have to pay off their credit card? If you're gone, you're gone. What are you gonna sue?
So the beneficiaries are not the ones who are legally responsible. It's whoever is the person who's in charge of administering your estate. So I'll just say briefly, if you have to go, if your kids have to go through the probate court system, then the judge issues what's called letters testamentary, which if there is no probate, then your beneficiaries cannot. Yeah, they can. So when a person passes away, what they leave behind is called their estate. And the estate is kind of like a legal person. And then there's an individual who's in charge of administering that. So when I mentioned administering your loved one's estate, that's what I was referring to. So whoever is in charge, if you have a will, you've named somebody, if you don't have a will, you didn't make any documents, and you have beneficiaries or family members who want their money, one of them has to step up to be in charge in order to get their assets, get their inheritance. So that person would get the legal authority, whether that's through probate court, whether that's through what's called a small estate affidavit. So if there's no probate and you have very little assets left, the person who's in charge has to sign what's called a small estate affidavit. And that's the official document that says they're in charge. They are legally responsible for paying off or settling all of your debts from your creditors. They cannot take any of your estate, so any money you've left behind, until they've completed that. That is a legal requirement. If they take the money and they don't pay off, they'll say that credit card bill, the credit card company then can go after them for mismanagement of the estate funds and that they were owed money and they were not paid. So that's how that would work out. If somebody wants to commit fraud, that's a whole different situation. I'm not really commenting on that. I'm just saying they would be legally required to settle or pay off your credit card bill. Are there any other questions online?
I do not see any. If you guys have questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Looks like we have one here.
Oh, sorry, I was checking something, sorry. I see hand over here on the right first. So if your loved one passed away and they don't have that much left, if they have very few assets, that's when, if you want to be in charge of administering anything, that's when you would use a small estate affidavit, which I mentioned, which is basically you swearing that there isn't that much money left behind by the person who passed away. And that's the document you use. And if you have to go through probate, I can't say whether a loved one will or will not. I don't know, because it depends on how many assets they had, what is the value of each of the assets, who were the owners on that asset, were there beneficiaries on the asset, things like that. For example, let's say if you have a retirement account when you pass away, or your loved one passed away and they had a retirement account and they didn't really have much else, but the beneficiary they named on their retirement account passed away before they did, and there's no beneficiary who's alive on the loved one's retirement account, then the financial institution that manages that account, they can't just write a check out to whoever you say they should write a check out to. Depending on what the value is, that might have to be payable through the probate estate, and it might have to be probated to whoever the heirs are then. But it just depends. Yes, go ahead.
Your home, is there recommendations on how they be stored?
So the question was that I recommended that you keep your important documents at home, and is there a recommendation for the best way to store them? So there are a lot of different options to protect the documents. If you want to buy a safe, you can buy a safe that's portable. I myself have a fire resistant, water resistant, password kind of like locked document bag. So just in case there's a fire or a flood or something like that, hopefully those documents will be protected. That's just one option. There's a safe. You can make copies too. So for all documents where you don't need the original, you can make copies and then give copies to your loved one who's going to be in charge of handling all of that when you pass away. But for originals, just personally, my recommendation is to either have a safe or one of those document storage bags that's heat resistant and water resistant. Yes, right here. Online storage works for copies. So like I said, if you want to scan them, scan all your documents, you can store that online. There are a lot of online storage companies. The problem with that is just, I personally think it's easier for your information to be stolen online in this day and age than it is to be stolen from your house in the bottom of a drawer somewhere. So if people break into your home, they're likely going to go to your bedroom to get all the jewelry, maybe your TV, whatever they can sell, things like that, or steal easily. They're probably not going to spend that much time rifling through your drawers to find your social security card and paperwork. But it's very easy to get hacked online. It happens to major companies, private companies that have tons and tons of money, and they pay people to protect that information. So you can also store it online. You just have to then keep in mind that if you do store everything online, you have to make sure you give the login information for that account to your loved one, so this way they can get to it. And if you don't give them the login information, then they have to either go through probate court or the small estate affidavit in order to have the legal authority to access it. But it really is up to you. It's your personal preference, whether you want to store everything online or you want to do it at home with a physical copy or do both. It's really up to you.
There's so much. Thank you so much. Your last slide here is your contact information. And as you mentioned, I'm going to share the document with everybody that registered, as well as your contact information and yours as well. So that is that. Thank you
Yes,
for
and thank you all for
everyone.
coming. If you do want more information about the seminars, for those of you at home, my email address and phone number are of course up on the slide. And for those of you who are here in person, if you want to leave your contact information with me, I'd be happy to add you to the email list for the future seminars. We do also, SEVA International also does more seminars on estate planning specifically. So wills, trusts, powers of attorney for healthcare, things like that. So if you want information, you feel free to come up to me at the end as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, the power of attorney for healthcare is also one, yes, yes.